3 men walked away that night, believing everything was finished. No witnesses, no evidence, but what if they were wrong? What if someone saw something, or worse, survived something? And what if the truth was already finding its way back to them? What really happened after that night? And who would expose it? This is where everything begins to unravel. The injured passengers were rushed to the closest medical facility, St. Mary's Catholic Hospital. It had been a head-on collision caused by dangerous overtaking. The driver and the passenger seated in front were in critical condition. Ruth, who had been seated behind the driver, was knocked unconscious by the impact. Most of the other passengers sustained multiple injuries, broken bones, cuts, and bruises, but they remained conscious and were listed in stable condition. The damaged bus was later towed away. The passengers' personal belongings were carefully collected. Ruth had her backpack strapped in front of her, so it was clearly labeled as hers. The remaining unclaimed boxes and bags were gathered and safely kept aside by hospital staff. Late that night, in the intensive care unit, Mr. Bellow's condition suddenly deteriorated. Alarms sounded as doctors and nurses rushed in. Despite every effort to resuscitate him, he coded and passed away with his death. The case was no longer one of attempted murder. It was now officially a murder case. It was announced on the morning news. The police confirmed Mr. Bellow's death and appealed to the public for help. They specifically urged the Good Samaritan, who had brought Mr. Bellow to the hospital, to come forward and assist with the investigation. On the other side of town, Mr. Ocon followed the story closely. He had hoped Mr. Bellow would survive so that the matter would end, without drawing him into police affairs. Now, he was in a dilemma. He still had the plate numbers he had carefully noted that night. He did not want public attention, and definitely wanted nothing to do with the police. Fear and uncertainty kept him silent, far away, on the other side of the country. Ruth woke up in a hospital bed. She was stable, with bruises and soreness from the accident, but no life-threatening injuries, as a nurse spoke to her gently. Another problem became clear. Ruth could not remember her name. She could not remember where she had been going, or why. Her mind was blank, the past wiped clean by the trauma. For the moment, everything seemed to be going well for the trio of Chuka, Jide, and Kunle, with Mr. Bellow dead, and Ruth missing and silent. It appeared they had one less problem to worry about. Mourning spread slowly across the city. At St. Mary's Catholic Hospital, Ruth sat upright in her bed, while a nurse checked her blood pressure. The doctor asked her simple questions. "What is your name?" Ruth stared blankly. I don't know. "Where are you traveling to?" She shook her head slowly. "I can't remember." The doctor wrote something on the chart. The accident had likely caused temporary memory loss. It was not uncommon after a traumatic head injury. For now, the hospital registered her as female passenger unknown identity. Her backpack had been recovered from the accident scene and placed beside her bed, but the staff had not yet gone through its contents. Across the state, the police investigation into Mr. Bellow's murder was gaining momentum. At the station, detectives spread photographs across a table, pictures of the burnt car, the roadside where it had been found, and the bush where the hunter had reported discovering the unconscious man. The car was set on fire to destroy evidence, one officer said. But whoever did this made mistakes, another replied. The investigation team began tracing Mr. Bellow's last known movements. Phone records showed his final activity the previous day. Bank withdrawals were examined. His family confirmed he had left home to finalize a land purchase. Detectives began searching for anyone who had met him that afternoon. Meanwhile, in different parts of the city, Chuka, Jide, and Kunle were already moving quietly. Kunle withdrew large amounts of cash from several accounts. Jide packed a suitcase and contacted a transport agent, who arranged cross-border trips. Chuka shut off his phone and began preparing to leave town before nightfall. Each of them believed the same thing. The case would soon grow cold. The only person who had seen Mr. Bello with them, the cleaner, had disappeared, but far away, at St. Mary's Hospital. A nurse finally opened the backpack labeled as belonging to the unidentified passenger. Inside were a few clothes, a phone with a dead battery, and a brown leather wallet. The nurse opened it. Inside was an identification card. Mr. Bello. The nurse stared at the identification card for a moment. The photograph on it was unmistakable. It was the murder case airing on the television. Mr. Bello. She looked again at the unconscious woman resting in the hospital bed. Something about the situation did not feel ordinary. The wallet had been found inside the backpack of the unidentified accident victim. The nurse called the doctor on duty and handed him the wallet. He examined the contents carefully: bank cards, identification, and several documents bearing Mr. Bello's name. Within minutes, the hospital administration contacted the police at the police station. The call immediately caught the attention of the investigation team handling the case. "You're saying a passenger from the accident bus has the victim's wallet?" the officer asked over the phone. "Yes," the hospital administrator replied. "The woman who survived the crash. She does not remember her identity." The room fell silent. This was the first solid lead they had received since Mr. Bello's death. A patrol team was dispatched to St. Mary's Catholic Hospital immediately. Back at the hospital, Ruth sat quietly in her bed, staring at the window. The morning sun filled the ward, but her mind remained empty. She could not remember how she had arrived there, where she had come from, or where she had been going. Footsteps approached the ward entrance. 2 police officers walked in. The doctor greeted them and handed over the brown leather wallet. "This was found in the patient's backpack," he explained. "She cannot remember anything about herself." One of the officers opened the wallet slowly. The contents confirmed it again. Mr. Bello's identification. The officer looked toward the woman sitting on the hospital bed. "Madam," he said gently, "do you know this man?" Ruth looked at the photograph. She stared at it for a long moment. Her brow tightened slightly, as if her mind were trying to grasp something just beyond reach. But nothing came. She slowly shook her head. "I'm sorry. I don't remember." The officers exchanged a glance. Somewhere in her memory lay the last known moments of Mr. Bello's life. But for now, those memories were locked away, hundreds of kilometers away. Chuka, Jide, and Kunle were already preparing to leave the country. They believed the story was ending. They had no idea that the most important witness in the murder case had just been found. The 2 officers remained in the ward for several minutes, observing the woman carefully. Ruth sat quietly on the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but confused. "Madame," one of the officers said again, "can you remember anything at all? Where you were traveling from? Anyone you were with?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "It's all blank," she replied softly. The doctor stepped forward. "She suffered a head injury during the accident. Memory loss after trauma like this can happen. Sometimes the memories return gradually." The officers nodded. They took photographs of the wallet and its contents, and recorded the details of the unidentified patient. One of them placed a call to the station to report the development. Within an hour, a senior detective was assigned to the case at the police headquarters. The investigation board had begun to fill with information. Mr. Bello's photograph sat in the center. Around it were maps, call records, and photographs from the scene where he had been found. Now, another photograph was added, An image of the unidentified woman from St. Mary's Hospital. A line was drawn between the two. Whoever she is, the detective said. She had Mr. Bellow's wallet. That means she crossed paths with him sometime before the attack. Another officer studied the timeline. Mr. Bellow was last seen the afternoon before he was found. If this woman was traveling overnight and ended up in that accident, she may have left the city shortly after. The detective nodded. Find out where that bus departed from. Meanwhile, in the city they had left behind, Chuka, Jide, and Kunle continued their quiet preparations. Kunle had already packed the travel bags and hidden large amounts of cash in different places. Jide arranged documents for a quick trip across the border. Chuka moved between several locations, avoiding familiar places. They spoke only briefly on the phone. We leave tonight, Kunle said. No delays, Jide replied. Once we cross, nobody will connect us to anything. None of them had heard the latest development. None of them knew that hundreds of kilometers away, a hospital nurse had opened a backpack and found the one object that tied everything together. Back at St. Mary's Hospital, the nurse returned Ruth's belongings. After the police finished documenting them, she placed the backpack on the small table beside the bed. Maybe something inside will help you remember, she said gently. Ruth slowly opened the bag. She pulled out a few clothes, then her phone. The battery was dead. She placed it aside and continued searching. Her hand touched a small folded receipt, tucked between the pockets of the bag. She opened it absent-mindedly. For a moment, she stared at it without understanding. Then something flickered in her mind, just for a second. A room, voices, men talking, bundles of money on a table. The image disappeared as quickly as it came. Ruth pressed her fingers against her temple, trying to hold on to the memory before it slipped away again. Ruth closed her eyes and tried to focus on the image that had briefly flashed through her mind. It had come suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. She sat still, breathing slowly, hoping it would return. But her mind remained blank. The nurse noticed her discomfort and stepped closer. Are you all right? I thought I remembered something, Ruth said quietly. But it's gone. The nurse gave her a reassuring smile. That can happen. Sometimes memories return slowly. Little by little, Ruth nodded and placed the folded receipt back into the bag. She leaned back against the pillow, exhausted from the effort. At the police headquarters, the investigation was moving forward. Detectives had traced the accident bus to the main transport park in the city. Officers were dispatched to the park to question ticket agents and drivers who had been on duty the previous night. One ticket clerk remembered clearly. Yes, he said, pointing to the passenger list. The bus left around 5 in the morning. There were many passengers, but I remember a young woman traveling alone. She bought a ticket late at night and waited in the terminal. The officer copied the information and added it to the report. If the woman in the hospital was that passenger, she had left the city only hours after Mr. Bellow had been attacked. Meanwhile, Mr. Ocon sat quietly in his small living room, listening to the radio. The news repeated the police appeal for the Good Samaritan who had helped Mr. Bellow to come forward. He stared at the piece of paper in his hand. On it were the 2 plate numbers he had carefully written down that night in the bush. He folded the paper again and slipped it back into his pocket. He was still undecided. In another part of the city, Kunle met briefly with Chuka and Jide inside a small apartment they had rented temporarily. We move tonight, Kunle said. No delays, Chuka nodded. The sooner we disappear, the better. Jide checked his phone one more time before switching it off completely. None of them knew that the police were already tracing the bus Ruth had taken. None of them knew that the only witness who had seen them with Mr. Bello was still alive, and somewhere inside her mind, the memories they feared most were slowly beginning to return. At St. Mary's Catholic Hospital, the afternoon passed quietly. Ruth remained in her bed, occasionally watching the activity in the ward. Nurses moved between patients, checking charts and adjusting for lines. Outside the window, the hospital compound was busy with visitors and staff. Later that evening, the doctor returned to check on her. "How are you feeling now?" he asked. "My head still hurts," Ruth replied, touching the bandage lightly. "But I feel stronger. That's good," the doctor said. "Your physical injuries are minor. The main concern is the memory loss. Sometimes it returns quickly. Sometimes it takes time." Ruth nodded slowly. "Do you know where I was going?" The doctor shook his head. "Not yet. But the police are trying to find out." Ruth glanced at the backpack beside her bed again. Back at police headquarters, the investigation team reviewed new information. From the transport park, the passenger list from the bus had been obtained, while some passengers had booked with identification. Several had paid in cash, without providing names. The detective placed the list on the table. "Find the driver and the conductor," he said. "They might remember the passengers." Another officer entered the room with an update. "The hospital confirmed the woman is conscious, but still suffering memory loss. Keep officers there," the detective replied. "If she remembers anything, we need to know immediately." The photograph of Ruth was pinned onto the investigation board, beside Mr. Bellows' picture. Elsewhere, Mr. Ocon sat quietly at his small table, staring again at the paper with the plate numbers. The radio repeated the news about the murder investigation. He turned it off. The room became silent. For several minutes, he sat without moving, thinking about the night. He had seen the men near the bush. The memory remained clear in his mind. Finally, he stood up and slipped the folded paper into his pocket again. He still had not decided what to do. In the apartment where they had gathered, Chuka, Jide, and Kunle continued their preparations. Travel bags were lined up against the wall. Money was divided and hidden inside clothing and envelopes. Phones were switched off and SIM cards removed. Kunle looked at the clock. "By nightfall we move," he said. Chuka nodded. "Once we cross the border, this whole thing ends." Jide leaned back in his chair, confident. "With Bello gone and the girl missing, there's no one left to connect us." For the first time since the news that morning, the tension in the room eased slightly. They believed the danger was fading. But far away in the hospital ward, Ruth suddenly closed her eyes again. Another image had flashed in her mind. This time, it lasted a little longer. A room, a desk, 3 men sitting across from another man, and a box full of money on the table. Ruth opened her eyes suddenly. Her breathing had quickened. The image had been clearer this time. A room, a table, 3 men sitting together, another man across from them, and a box filled with money. She pressed her hand to her temple, as if trying to steady the thought, before it slipped away again. The more she tried to hold the image, the more it faded, like fog disappearing in sunlight. The nurse nearby noticed her movement and approached. "Are you feeling pain again?" she asked. I saw something," Ruth said slowly. "I think it's a memory." The nurse immediately called the doctor. Within minutes, the doctor arrived, accompanied by one of the police officers who had been stationed at the hospital. "What did you remember?" the officer asked gently. Ruth closed her eyes again, trying to picture it. "A room," she said. "Men talking. Money on a table. Documents. Can you recognize any of the men?" Ruth shook her head. Their faces are not clear yet. The officer wrote down every word. Even the smallest detail mattered. Back at the police headquarters, the report from the hospital arrived quickly. The detective read it carefully. "She's beginning to remember," he said. An officer standing beside him nodded. "If her memory returns fully, she may identify the last people who saw Bello alive." The detective looked at the board again. Mr. Bello's photograph was still in the center, surrounded by new notes and evidence. "Then we must find those men before they disappear." That evening, Mr. Ocon sat quietly on a wooden bench outside his house. The folded paper with the plate numbers was still in his pocket. He could still see the scene clearly in his mind. The two cars, the men carrying something into the bush, the fire burning later in the distance. He sighed deeply. The news had said Mr. Bello was dead. The matter was now a murder case. For a long moment, he stared down the road as people passed by, going about their daily lives. Then he stood up slowly. Meanwhile, in the rented apartment, Chuka, Jide, and Kanle were ready to leave. Their bags were packed. The money had been divided. A contact was waiting to drive them toward the border later that night. Kunal zipped his travel bag and looked around the room one last time. "Once we leave, we don't come back," he said. The others agreed. They stepped outside and locked the door behind them. For the moment, they believed they had escaped. But at St. Mary's Hospital, Ruth closed her eyes again. Another memory was beginning to form. This time, a face was starting to appear. Ruth sat quietly in the hospital bed, her eyes closed, concentrating as hard as she could. The image in her mind struggled to become clearer. The room returned first. She could see the desk again. Papers spread across it, the open box of money, bundles stacked neatly. Then the men, 3 of them sitting on one side, another man across the table. She leaned forward slightly, pressing her fingers to her temple. One face began to sharpen. A man leaning back in a chair, another counting money, then a third standing near the desk. Suddenly Ruth opened her eyes again. The memory slipped away before she could grasp it fully. The police officer beside the doctor noticed the movement. "Did you remember something else?" he asked. Ruth nodded slowly. There were 3 men, and another man sitting across from them. They were counting money. The officer wrote quickly in his notebook. "Do you know where this was?" Ruth shook her head. "No, but it felt like an office." The doctor glanced at the officer. Even fragmented memories like these were important. "Let her rest," the doctor said. "Pushing too hard may slow the recovery." The officer nodded and stepped outside the ward, immediately placing a call to the investigation team. Everything together. At police headquarters, the update changed the tone of the room. "She remembers from men in a room with money," the detective said. "That matches the land deal theory," another officer replied. They already knew. Mr. Bello had withdrawn a large amount of cash before he disappeared. "Find out who he was meeting that day," the detective ordered. "Business partners, land agents, anyone." An officer began working through Mr. Bello's phone records. One number appeared repeatedly. A number registered to Kanle Adiemi, owner of Tasty Restaurant. The detective circled the name with a pen. "Bring him in for questioning. Run his background," he added. Within minutes, the details came in. "He owns a restaurant, Tasty Restaurant, not far from the city center." The detective looked up immediately. "Send a team there." By the time that order was given, Kanle, Chuka, and Jide were already on the move. Their vehicles sped down the highway as evening faded into night. They planned to lay low for a few days before leaving the country. Inside the car, the mood was tense but controlled. Conley sat in the back seat, silent, watching the road behind them. Once we cross the border in 4 or 5 days, Chuka said, trying to sound confident. This is over, Jide nodded. No witnesses. No evidence. None of them knew. The police had just found Conley's name, and none of them knew that Ruth's memory was slowly returning at Tasty Restaurant. Police arrived to find the place operating normally. A few customers were still eating. They asked for the owner. A staff member directed them to the head chef. Conley, the chef said. He traveled out of state. Family visit. Where exactly? The detective asked. The chef shook his head. He didn't say. The officers exchanged looks. They presented a warrant. We'll need to search the premises. They moved toward the inner office. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. A desk, chairs, cabinets. But the search began carefully. One officer paused. Sir. He pointed to a faint stain near the desk. The detective crouched and examined it closely. Possible blood, he said quietly. Photos were taken immediately. Drawers were opened. Documents recovered. Land papers. Agreements. Survey maps. Looks like land transactions, one officer noted. The detective nodded slowly. The same kind Bello came for. The pieces were beginning to connect. At St. Mary's Hospital. Ruth's condition had improved, but her memory came in fragments. That night, the images returned more clearly. An office. A table covered with documents. Bundles of money. She saw Mr. Bello sitting across from 3 men. He was signing papers. She saw herself entering with a tray. She placed a bottle of water on the table. He thanked her. Then she left. The memory stopped. Ruth woke suddenly, breathing faster. The nurse approached gently. Did you remember something? Ruth nodded. I saw a room, an office, men counting money. I brought him water. The police officer nearby was called in. He wrote everything down carefully. It looked like an office inside a restaurant, Ruth added slowly. I think I worked there. Back at headquarters. The report arrived. The detective read it twice. She remembers Bello in an office. Inside a restaurant, another officer looked up immediately. Tasty Restaurant. The room went quiet. The detective nodded. Now we know where the meeting happened. The investigation moved quickly. A forensic team returned to the restaurant. This time, the office was examined thoroughly. The stain was collected. Photographs taken from every angle. Documents were catalogued. At the same time, Conley's phone signal was traced. He left the city earlier today, an officer reported. The detective didn't hesitate. Alert highway patrol. Circulate the names Conley, Chuka, Jide, if they're running. They won't be alone the next morning at the hospital. Ruth was shown photographs. Take your time, the officer said gently. She studied them one by one. Then she paused. Her finger rested on one image. This one, the officer leaned forward. Conley Adiemi. You're sure? Ruth nodded slowly. He owns the restaurant. He was in the office. That confirmation was sent immediately. To headquarters. The detective listened carefully. That's it, he said. Conley Adiemi is now our primary suspect. Meanwhile, far from the city, the 3 men continued their journey. They arrived late at night, at a quiet house owned by Conley. Remote, isolated, safe or so they believed. They settled in, making final plans for the border. Inside, tension lingered beneath their silence. Conley stared into the darkness, unaware that everything had already begun to collapse behind him. Back at police headquarters, the case had come together. The burnt car, the witness report, the restaurant, the office, the bloodstain, Ruth's testimony. All connected, the detective said, standing before the board. We're not chasing shadows anymore. Coordinate with Border Patrol, he ordered. Track every route out. They think they're escaping. He paused. But we're already ahead of them. Meanwhile, in his small home on the outskirts of the city, Mr. Ocon sat quietly, with a folded piece of paper in his hand. On it were the plate numbers. He had memorized that night. The radio played softly in the background. Police are appealing for witnesses in the Bello case. Ocon stared at the numbers again. He knew what he had seen. 2 cars. Men moving in the dark. A body. He exhaled slowly. Keeping silent was no longer an option. Within minutes, he stood up, dressed, and stepped out into the morning. The police station was not far. When he arrived, the atmosphere was busy. Phones ringing, officers moving quickly. He approached the front desk. I have information about Mr. Bello, he said. The officer on duty straightened immediately. Go on, Ocon handed over the paper. These are the plate numbers of the cars I saw that night. The officer glanced at them, then called for a detective. Within minutes, Ocon was seated, recounting everything, what he saw, where he stood, how the cars moved, and how one of them was later burned. Every detail was recorded carefully. By the time he finished, the case had taken another major step forward. At police headquarters, the new information was added to the board: plate numbers, vehicle movement, location of the bush, burnt car. The detective stepped back, studying everything. This confirms it, he said. We now have vehicles, suspects, location, and sequence. Another officer nodded. We can track their route out of the city. Do it, the detective replied. Send it to Highway Patrol and border units immediately at St. Mary's Hospital. Ruth sat quietly, holding the brown wallet in her hands. She opened it slowly. Inside were identification cards. Mr. Bello's name stared back at her. The officer beside her noticed. That's important evidence, he said gently. Her fingers tightened slightly around it. The memories were no longer distant fragments. They were beginning to connect. Back on the road, Conley and his partners were moving again. The next phase of their escape had begun. The highway stretched endlessly ahead. Inside the car, silence had taken over. No more confident talk. No more certainty. Just tension. There's a checkpoint ahead, the driver said suddenly. Conley looked up. In the distance, bright lights cut through the darkness. Several vehicles were already lined up. Police officers moved between them. Connell's chest tightened. Just stay calm, Chuka muttered. We've done nothing wrong, but even he didn't sound convinced. At the checkpoint, officers worked methodically, 1 car at a time. Documents checked, faces examined. A radio crackled nearby. Be on the lookout for 3 suspects connected to the Bello case. The names followed. Conley Adiemi, Chukan Waffer, Jide Balagan. Inside the car, everything froze. No one spoke. The vehicle rolled forward slowly. An officer stepped up. Good evening. Vehicle inspection. The driver handed over the papers. Another officer walked around the car, shining his flashlight inside. The beam passed over each face, then paused, returned, focused. The officer stepped back slightly. He looked again, more carefully this time. Another officer approached with a printed notice. He compared the faces, then nodded. That's them. Everything changed in an instant. Step out of the vehicle. Within seconds, the 3 men were surrounded. Hands raised. No escape. Handcuffs clicked shut, one after another. Conley tried to speak. There must be a mistake you can explain at the station, the officer replied. The radio came alive again. Control, this is Highway Unit 7. 3 suspects in custody. Hours later, at police headquarters, the report came in. The detective listened quietly, then nodded. Bring them in. At the station, the 3 men were placed in separate rooms. The interrogations began immediately. The evidence was already overwhelming. Photographs, phone records, the restaurant, the burnt car, the witness. The detective entered Conley's room and placed Mr. Bellow's photograph on the table. You know him, he said. Conley said nothing. We know he came to your restaurant. We know money changed hands. Silence. In the next rooms, the detective added calmly. Your friends are being questioned too. He stood up. Someone will talk. He was right. Hours later, Chuka broke. We didn't mean to kill him, he said, his voice shaking, his composure finally collapsing. And just like that, the truth began to unfold. The plan, the fraud, the meeting, the argument, the blow, the panic, the car, the bush, the fire, every detail, written down, recorded, confirmed. Weeks later, the case moved to court. The courtroom was filled, quiet, heavy with expectation. Mr. Bellow's family sat in the front row. His wife, Mrs. Bellow, dressed in a simple black outfit, held a handkerchief tightly in her hands. Her face showed strength, but her eyes carried deep pain. Beside her sat their children, confused, silent, watching everything unfold. Far too early in their lives, they listened as the case that had shattered their home was laid bare before strangers. Ruth was called to the witness stand. She walked slowly, but steadily, her voice calm, though her hands trembled slightly. She took a deep breath and began. I worked at Tasty Restaurant, she said. She described the day, the office, the tray in her hands, the bottle of water. I entered the room, and I saw him, she continued, Mr. Bellow. Sitting at the table, she explained how documents were spread across the desk, how bundles of money were being counted, how 3 men sat across from him. I placed the water and left, she said softly. The courtroom was silent. Do you see any of those men here today? The prosecutor asked. Ruth lifted her eyes slowly. Her gaze moved across the room and stopped. She pointed. Him, she said. That's Conley. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. And the others. I remember them. Not clearly before, she said, her voice gaining strength. But now, I recognize them. She pointed again. Chuka, Jide. Her testimony settled heavily in the room. Then Mr. Okon was called. He walked to the stand with a calm, steady presence, a man used to the quiet of the bush, now standing in the center of justice. He took the oath and began. That night, he said, I was on my way out for hunting. He described the darkness, the unusual movement, the 2 cars. I became suspicious, he continued. So I stayed hidden. He explained how he watched the men move quickly, how they brought out a body, how they dumped it into the bush. The courtroom grew tense. I memorized the plate numbers, he said, holding up a copy of the paper. The prosecutor stepped closer. And what did you do after they left? I waited, Okon replied. Then I went to check. He paused briefly. I thought the man was dead. A slight shift in the courtroom. But when I checked, he was still breathing. Mrs. Bellow covered her mouth, tears slipping down her face. So I called my friend, Okon continued. We carried him and took him to the hospital. Why did you leave? Okon lowered his eyes slightly. I was afraid, he said honestly. I didn't want trouble with the police. The courtroom remained quiet. But I came back, he added firmly, because it was the right thing to do. The evidence spoke clearly. The testimonies aligned. The records confirmed it. The chain was complete on the day of judgment. The courtroom was filled again. The three men stood in the dock. No confidence now, no arrogance, just silence. The judge adjusted his glasses and began to speak. This court finds that the accused engaged in a deliberate act of fraud, he said. He paused, and that their actions led directly to the violent attack and eventual death of Mr. Bello. The room held its breath. Kanle Adiemi, Chukan Wafer, Jide Balagan. A final pause. You are hereby found guilty. A quiet sob escaped from Mrs. Bello. The judge continued. You are sentenced accordingly under the law for fraud, conspiracy, and the unlawful act leading to the death of Mr. Bello. Moments later, the officers moved in. Handcuffs were secured once again. The three men were led out of the courtroom. Outside, a black Maria van waited. Its doors stood open, one by one. They were guided inside. The doors shut firmly. The van pulled away slowly. Months later, life moved on. Ruth started again, in a different city. Quiet, careful, stronger. Mr. Okon returned to his simple life, hunting, farming, and living with the quiet knowledge that he had chosen courage when it mattered most. Mrs. Bello and her children carried on, holding tightly to memories, learning to live with loss, and finding strength in justice. And the story of Mr. Bello remained a warning that greed may begin with a plan, but it rarely ends the way those who start it expect.